Thank you to the worship team and to Keith and to those who've helped with communion this morning. Somebody left a Toblerone on. Whose is this? If nobody's going to claim it, it could be yours. There will be a wrestle for it after the service. So continuing in our series in the Gospel of John, going on to chapter 11, and it's the fifth I am statement. I am the resurrection and the life. So we're going to explore that this morning. Back in South Africa, we had a lady on staff with us who used to keep the church clean. She had a massive job because it was an enormous church with a lot of other venues that went off it. And her name is Sana. And Sana, just sort of a bit of a side thing, she had one cloth that she went around with. One cloth. I always wondered what she did with that cloth. And then our secretary, Penny, decided the one day to find out, Sana, what do you use that cloth for? She says, I use it to clean. She says, what do you clean with it? She says, I clean the windows. I clean the counters. I clean up when there's a mess. I clean the cups and saucers with it, and I wash them. And I clean the toilets. There was a cloud of dust as Penny left the premises to go and purchase a set of color-coded cloths that were going to be used for various things. And Sunny used to walk around with these cloths in her belt, or different color on her belt. And she used to pull off the one that she would use. But what happened with Sana? Sana was married through what was known as a traditional marriage. That meant that her and her husband, when they decided to get married, they went before the chief, and the chief and the elders just said, you've paid the correct amount in terms of the dowry. They called it lobola, and you're not married. So there was no documentation in terms of government that would say that you're married. Her husband fell gravely ill. He was in hospital, and we knew that he was going to die. Now the problem was, in the African culture, is that if you as a woman, your husband dies, the husband's family come and take everything, absolutely everything. The thing that you are left with is the clothes on your back. That is standard. That's what happens. We may be quite horrified, but that's what happens. And Sana came to me the one day. She was in tears, and she said, this is what's going to happen. I'm going to lose everything. They know that we're married, but I don't have the piece of paper. So I said, no problem at all. Bundled her into the car, along with my secretary, Penny, and we went off to the hospital, and we performed the marriage ceremony. During the marriage ceremony, the husband fell unconscious. He hadn't signed yet. And I was standing there, and I was saying to Penny and to Sana, can we just take his hand and put the pen in it, and then we just make a squiggle? And she says, no, you can't. She says, what you need to do, you need to be honest, Royden. She said, you need to pray that he wakes up. I said, no, but it's easier if you just get the pen in his hand and just do that. It's him signing. We all know what's going to happen. No, that's what we need to do. So I said, okay, fine. So we prayed, and he woke up. And we got him to sign. About 2 days later, he passed away. The following week, the family arrived with trucks to come and collect everything. And Sanna walked out with a piece of paper and she said, I own this property now. Because I am legally married in the eyes of the government. You can do nothing. Well, they used grammar and adjectives that I'm not allowed to use here from the pulpit to describe her and the fact that she had got married and all, and because they were all counting on the debts that they could pay off, the new furniture that they could be getting and so on, and they couldn't get any of it. They had to leave the tail between their legs. Keep that story in mind because that will help you a little bit to understand this passage. I mean, we find that the gospel writers, and particularly John, likes to show how Jesus enters into chaos, and then the glory of God is shown out of that chaos. And with the beginning of the church, as the church moved out, it didn't move into a nice, comfortable world. It moved into a pagan world that itself was very chaotic. It got persecuted, first of all, by the Jews and then by Rome. And so its world was turned upside down. And these people began to see the evil of the world, not because the world suddenly got more evil, but because their eyes were opened to seeing the righteousness of God versus the evil of the world. And they realized through the power of God's Spirit that they had been called to be witnesses, and by being witnesses, so God would change the world within which they lived. And it seems to be that the Western church, which used to be 100 years ago, was still a powerhouse for missions, has forgotten about the power of the presence of God with us to take the gospel out. We've become afraid, as though we hide away. And so I hope that today we will see what it means, the power of God's presence when He is with us. So Jesus introduces Himself as the resurrection and the life. And in order for us to understand that, we need to see the context within which it appears. So John records an event that happens. It's an ordinary, everyday event. Lazarus is ill. We all know illness. We know about it. So it's not so much of a big deal, but it is a big deal. And if we understand this through the mindset of the ancient Near East, we begin to see how big a deal Lazarus' sickness was. Living in his home are his two sisters, Mary and Martha. And just with a meager understanding of ancient Near Eastern culture, you'll begin to realize what is actually going on here. These two women living in Lazarus' home are either unmarried or widows. And in that culture, an unmarried or a widow could not own property or work. And so Lazarus, being the one who looked after them, was the one who covered them. And so if he died, everything that they owned was gone. How terrible this is. This wasn't just going to be a case of, oh gosh, we have a funeral to organize for our brother and we're going to miss our brother. This was going to be overshadowed more by their own slow death of starvation and abuse that would happen to them from the people in the village and wherever else they went. Because a woman on her own was open to huge amounts of abuse. She was seen as just the property of the village. And sadly to say is that the village predator would have his way with them. And so Jesus has this to say in John 11, verse 5 onwards. It says, talking about Lazarus, he says, "This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." Now, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was for 2 more days. That's strange now. He knows what the impact of what's going to happen, but he stays there. And then he said to his disciples, "Let us go back to Judea." Okay, there's a lot happening here. Several times Jesus turns a situation upside down. He takes the theological outview or outlook of the people of that day, and he turns it around. Like what we saw with the blind man. The people held this view that man being born blind, it must have happened somewhere along the line that his parents must have done something wrong, so therefore he's getting punished. Now in this instance, Mary and Martha, this chaos coming upon their life, what's going on here? How could God allow this? Jesus, why are you hanging back? Why are you not there with her? It creates a bit of chaos in our mind. We don't see it necessarily because we're seeing it through Western eyes. But Asian, Near Eastern eyes, they would look at this and they would go, what kind of God is this? Who hangs back to allow this man who is gravely ill to die? And now the impact that's going to be for Mary and Martha. Does he not care? That will be the question. And other disciples highlight a further chaos. That for us, we may understand this a bit better. So they say, verse 8 onwards, it says, "But Rabbi, a short while ago, the Jews tried to stone you there. Yet you're going back." You see the chaos that's happening here? A short time ago, they wanted to stone you. Now you want to go back. What's wrong with you? Can you imagine what would happen if we sent a group of people from this congregation to somewhere where we knew they were going to be hostile towards the gospel? There may be a delegation coming to the board of elders to say, we think you need to rethink this. I remember when we sent a group from our church up into Egypt to the area where the Arab Spring began. Very hostile towards the gospel. And when we prayed for them in the service, some of the people said, this may be the last time we'll see them. You see, that's true. It may be. They all came back. They said they didn't see anything violent at all. And not only is this chaos of Mary and Martha, it's a chaos of danger. And so when you look at this picture with the mind of ancient Near East, you go, this is madness. This looks like an irresponsible God. Holding back, not healing this guy who is sick, allowing him to die. Mary and Martha are now in danger, and then deciding, well, let's go back into danger. When I was doing my undergraduate, one of the courses that I was doing in our missions course, there was a year-long elective that we had to go and live permanently in what is known as an informal settlement. And I was at the University of Natal in the campus in Pietermaritzburg, which is inland from Durban, about 90 kilometers inland from Durban. And they said to us, pick an informal settlement. And so we surveyed the area that was around the university, about 30 kilometers around, and we realized it was very dangerous. So we put our case forward. That's dangerous. I said, where else? So we looked at that, was a bit further down towards Durban, about 90 kilometers away, and there were some good places there. Reasonable services were reasonable within walking distance, and we said, that's a nice place. And then we heard that there was other areas going up north that was now about 150 kilometers away from the university, that where there had been a tremendous amount of violence. And we said, look, that's off the cards. Because that is violence. That's the heart of the violence in South Africa. They are running wars in those streets. And so the professor said to us, you guys make the choice where you want to go. And about 2 days later, we came back, we sat with him, and he said, I've made the choice for you. Where are we going? He said, I'm sending you to a place called Ambawoti. And we always realized that's smack bang in the middle of the most violent place in South Africa. And he said to us, if you want to learn about Jesus, go to where you'll see him working. I was mugged twice there. But you know what? I saw God at work. Because the street gangs came to my rescue both times. I was rescued by criminals. Even God can use a criminal. It's fantastic. See, when there is opportunity to see God's glory in chaos, just understand that the light of the gospel is going to shine there. And that becomes a statement to the world of how real God is. We can't demonstrate so much how real God is in a type of, you would call it like, almost like a clinical environment like this. You need to see it in the midst of those who don't know Jesus, when they come to know Jesus. The disciples not grasping what's happening. We pick up here in verse 11. It says, after he had said this, he went on to tell them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I'm going there to wake him up. His disciples replied, Lord, if he sleeps, he will get better. This is logic. And Jesus said, Jesus had been speaking about his death, but his disciples thought he meant natural sleep. So then he said plainly to them, Lazarus is dead. There you go. He's dead. And for your sake, I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. Let's go to him. And it's just, in that statement, that's where you start to unravel. Those kinds of statements challenge our faith drastically. When it comes to a point where God may say to us, I'm glad I was not doing something there in your life at that point so that I can do something greater. And we might go, hang on a second. No, we don't want that. We like the comfort. No, Lazarus is dead. I'm glad I was not with him. But let's go into danger. So they headed for the home of Lazarus, 2 miles from Jerusalem. Jesus leading the way into mortal danger. When they arrive, they discover that Lazarus has been in the tomb for 4 days. Remember, John had written that he held back 2 days. So when the message came to them, Lazarus was already dead for 2 days. Lazarus has been dead for a while. The arrival of the home, you need to see it once again through ancient Near Eastern eyes. It's a place of deep, deep sadness. This is not just about Lazarus is gone. This is Mary and Martha will now also die. Remember the story of who are they in Ruth? Naomi and Ruth. There we go. You got it. It was quite obvious, hey? Remember that story? How they were dead. Let's just die together. This is Mary and Martha's story now. The place is filled with deep sadness. In verse 21, we pick up, as Jesus comes to Martha, Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. See that? This is hard, because the statement, there's two statements here. Let's pick up the second statement. It says, but I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. Let's see these two statements, because the one is often overshadows the other. We don't see the first one because the second one grabs us as we spiritualize something. And Mary, later on, we pick up in the story, asks Jesus the same thing. Lord, if you had been here, our brother would not have died. Here's the chaos. Her pain, their pain, is so deep. If you'd not been here, we would not be in this situation, about to face our own death. Our family is wiped out because you didn't arrive. Jesus says to her, verse 23, your brother will rise again. Martha answers a good church answer. I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. A good church answer. You'd earn points. You'd be invited to the pastor's home for dinner. But a pain and a desperation so deep, she can't see. It's so deep, she can't see who Jesus is in the midst of that. And I'm sure many of us have been in that kind of place, where the pain gets so much that it feels as though, God, you cannot reach out to him. He's there somewhere. But you've got to realize that he's here with us, in the midst of it. And in the field of theology, we talk about it as the pathos of God. God who suffers alongside and with us. In the midst of where we are, he suffers with us. And that's the message that the world wants to hear. Sometimes when we get ourselves involved in so much ethereal stuff, the world goes, well, what's that going to do for me, in my situation, right here and now? Right here. So what up there? So what? And we'll lose them. You don't have an audience for the world, but they will listen when we talk about Jesus, who is sovereign, and that he is all powerful, and that he can actually change circumstances. And when we talk about how he has changed circumstances, then I'll listen. Because I want to be honest. You hear very honest conversations in pubs. Back in South Africa, when I was in this place, Amaoti, there in these local pubs were called shebeens. And in the shebeens, you can't even describe the type of behavior that would happen there. But there was honest talk. People spoke honestly. They shared their problems honestly, and you'd listen to them. Part of this course that we had to be on for a year was to go and listen, just for the entire year, listen to the conversations of the people. You'd hear over-spiritualized conversations in churches, but you'd hear where the people really were in the shebeen. They spoke their heart. And Martha speaks her heart to Jesus. Where were you? He says to her, I'm the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? Yes, Lord, she replied. I believe You are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into the world. Okay, what was meant here? Because Peter had also made a similar declaration, but he didn't understand it. You see, to the Jew, resurrection was what was to come. It was out of reach. And life is the beginning. It's out of reach. And I've got these two things. I want to try and reach them. And if I over-spiritualize, yes, at the end of life, there's a resurrection. But at the beginning of life, there was life. And I try and reach these two. But what about now? And Jesus saying, I am the resurrection and the life. There he's standing in their midst. In the beginning of the gospel, John records, it says, and the word became flesh and made his dwelling in amongst us, in our midst, and we have seen his glory and grace. Right there, the resurrection and the life. He who is eternally into the future, he who is eternally into the past, all coming right into the midst of where she is at. And the best way you're going to see how powerful this God is give a situation of such desperation that you don't know how you're ever going to get out of it. And how will resurrection be drawn from the future into the present? And how will life be drawn from there when he spoke and come into the present and see him at work? And now we see him as he comes to Martha and he asks her this question. Where is he? Let's pick it up here in John from verse 33. When Jesus saw her weeping, the Jews who had come along with her also, notice this, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Okay, if we could just keep our finger on that. He says, where have you laid him? Come and see, Lord, he replied. Second one, he wept. Keep your finger on those, and then we notice, as they come to the tomb, verse 38, once more deeply moved. The English doesn't quite grasp it. Some of the literature that I was reading, they were talking about how it just didn't grasp it. So they went into other languages. How did they grasp this? In the German, deeply moved is translated, he was angry in spirit and shook. Angry in spirit and shook. Jesus sees the situation and he reacts to it. I don't like this. God in our midst saying, I don't like this. So that he can show us that he's not just so much up there, but he's right here with us. And he feels exactly what we feel. He responds to it and he says, that is not right. It's not right. Justice will come here. And in our witness to the world, we need to learn how to testify that the God whom we serve is concerned about these things and he's moved by them. So he says to Martha, verse 39, take away the stone. She says the obvious. There'll be a bad smell in there. He's been dead for 4 days. She's not seeing because the grief is so heavy on her. We know what the story, how it goes. And Jesus says to her, did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? The worship team can start coming up. We see that glory when we see God, who is transcendent, become immanent. And we recognize that. If we remain in such a place where we are too ethereal up there. When the crisis hits, we don't know a God who is imminent, and we get knocked over. And our witness is nullified to the world. But if I can see him right here in the midst of my own chaos, and that witness is testified out to the world, the people of the world look at this and they go, that's different. That's the kind of God I want to serve, who changes these circumstances. That's the God. But if we hide that away by being too up there, we have no good in our witness. We may be good in an interest group. We want to talk about those things. But practicality, the world just look at us and go, I don't want to know that God. I want to know the one who's there. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us, and we have seen his glory. And that's what makes the gospel so attractive. God with us. Let's worship.